Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 97, Anatolia Crumbles. Last time we saw the Seleucids get comprehensively annihilated at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE. In fact, if you believe the Roman historian Livy, 200 times as many Seleucids lost their lives as Romans. Today, let's close out the war and see what the after effects of this Seleucid humiliation are. As we touched upon in episode 96, Antiochus III fled the battlefield following his defeat. He ran away with only a few attendants. All the while, Thyatira and Magnesia by Sipylus were sending delegations to the Romans to hand their cities over to the victors. By midnight the day after the battle, Antiochus had been joined by a few soldiers and reached the gates of Sardis. Here, he learnt that his son and crown prince Seleucus and some friends of his had moved on to Apamea. Accordingly, at about 4th watch, he left Sardis and headed straight for Apamea. His wife and daughter went with him on this journey. An attendant called Zeno was left in charge of Sardis, while Timon was given control of the region of Lydia. However, they were scorned by the populace and delegates were dispatched to the Romans. As you can see, Antiochus's Anatolian Empire is not exactly looking healthy. Now, some things need unpacking here. What exactly is 4th Watch, and who were this wife and daughter Antiochus had with him? Well, if my surface level research is correct, 4th Watch is between 3 and 6 in the morning. As for the identity of his family, I believe that this wife may be Euboea, the woman Livy reports Antiochus III married shortly before the war began, but Wikipedia claims Antiochus had no children with her, so I'm not sure who this daughter is. Who knows, given that Prince Seleucus was on this Anatolian campaign, maybe it's one of his daughters by Laodike III. Regardless, Antiochus III headed for Apamea to join his son and heir. In the meantime, Ephesus, Tralles, and Magnesia on the Meander also surrendered to Rome. When the Seleucid naval commander Polyxenides learned of the defeat at Magnesia, he left Ephesus with his fleet and sailed out to Patara in the region of Lycia. Here, he docked and sent his men inland, being afraid of an encounter with the nearby Rhodian fleet. The Seleucids who had been on the fleets accordingly headed into Syria. Meanwhile again, all across Asia, and by this I assume we're talking about Anatolia, cities put themselves under Consul Scipio's protection and defected to Rome. In essence, Anatolia's cities were falling like a house of cards. Consul Scipio himself reached Sardis, with Scipio Africanus setting out from Elea in Pergamon to join him when he was feeling well enough. Remember that Africanus has been ill and consequently was not at the Battle of Magnesia. Anyway, Antiochus now sent a messenger to the Romans, with a man called Publius Scipio in Livy acting as an intermediary to allow a full-on negotiation. Incidentally, I think this Publius Scipio refers to Scipio Africanus, although Livy doesn't call him Africanus explicitly in the text. Once permission was allowed, Zeuxis, ex-governor of Lycia, and the king's nephew Antipater arrived. They initially met with Eumenes II of Pergamon, expecting him to be fully set against peace, but finding him agreeable enough. So, they met up with Africanus, and eventually got to Consul Scipio with Africanus's goodwill. Yet again, it feels like Consul Scipio is tangential in what should be his own story. Feel free to imagine him resuming grinding his teeth. Anyway, at a larger discussion, Zeuxis spoke for the Seleucid king. He asked for forgiveness for Antiochus's past transgressions against Rome from the winners of the conflict, and cited Rome's past mercy to conquered foes. Zeuxis tried to flatter the Romans by pointing out that they were now rulers of the world thanks to their victory at Magnesia, and they should be accordingly merciful. Now, it feels to me that Anatolia wavering does not make the Romans masters of anything, but I suppose you say what you have to in order to get what you want. Essentially, Zeuxis was suing for peace. According to the Roman historian Livy, the Romans already had their response before Zeuxis even started speaking, and Africanus was chosen to reply. Again, Consul Scipio grinding his teeth and clenching his fists. Africanus held that the Romans had wanted to bargain as equals before hostilities began and would do so now again. The same terms would be offered. The Seleucids would stay out of Europe and recede past the Taurus Mountains, abandoning all of Anatolia. Furthermore, reparations of 15,000 talents would be paid. 500 would be paid as a down payment, and then 2,500 once the Senate and Roman people had ratified the peace, and then a further 1,000 talents as a yearly payment. Now, this all probably seems a bit abstract if we're talking about talents. However, this currency has cropped up before in Roman history. For comparison, at the end of the First Punic War, Rome had levied an indemnity of 32,000 talents in total on their defeated enemy the Carthaginians. Note that these were silver talents, so I believe we're working with silver talents in the latter case as well. However, to make it a bit less abstract and ancient worldy, let's use a conversion from a book called The History of the Roman Republic. When discussing the indemnity against the Carthaginians, paid at 3,200 talents per year, this book values 3,200 talents at over £500,000. If we use £500,000 as the value for 3,200 talents, accordingly the Seleucid fee of 15,000 would come out to about £2.34 million. However, we're not quite done because this book was published in 1932, so this is 1932 pounds. Converting to 2025 money, the Bank of England calculates this £2.34 million at a value of, today, around 142 million. So, you get the overall picture, it's a lot of money. The terms were not quite as harsh as the Carthaginians were forced to suffer decades earlier, but still very severe. The Romans further stipulated that Eumenes II of Pergamon should also receive 400 talents as payment, along with any debts that had been owed by the Seleucids to Eumenes' father. There would also be 20 hostages given to the Romans, who the Romans themselves would choose. Next up, and this is an important one, Hannibal would be given to the Romans. This was non-negotiable. As long as Hannibal remained in the Seleucid court, the Romans did not believe peace could come, and there would be no peace. Thoas the Aetolian and other warmongers would also be surrendered. In Thoas's case, this is given that he spurred the Aetolian League to war against Rome. Africanus finished his terms with a warning. Antiochus III was, Africanus pointed out, negotiating from a far weaker position than he had been before. I'm going to quote the warning he gave from Book 37 of Livy's History, section 47. Quote, "If he, meaning Antiochus III, now delays, let him be assured that it is more difficult to drag down the majesty of kings from the topmost pinnacle to the halfway mark than to hurl it from that point to the bottom." End quote. In other words, don't delay, or the Romans will break you completely. However, Africanus need not have worried. Antiochus had told his diplomats to accept whatever peace terms Rome would give. Cassius Dio tells us that he was reluctant to do so, but he did it anyway. Only one of these terms he could not agree to. This is because Hannibal fled the Seleucid court. Who knows, maybe Antiochus III let him sneakily escape, and then publicly proclaimed what a shame it was that he didn't have Hannibal anymore, so couldn't hand him over to the Romans. Regardless of how it happened, the Carthaginian general headed straight to the king of Bithynia. Prusias I would now host the twice-exiled Carthaginian general. So, Africanus and co. sent envoys to Rome to discuss and ratify the resulting peace terms. Consul Scipio, yes, he is still here, divided his army between Magnesia on the Meander, Tralles, and Ephesus. Several days later, Antiochus's envoys who would go on to Rome showed up, along with hostages. the envoys, Eumenes II, and diplomats from the Anatolian people all left for Rome. That's it for today's episode. In episode 98, we will deal with how these envoys get on in Rome following the acceptance of the preliminary peace terms by Antiochus III. However, we're not quite done, because I'm going to take this opportunity to lay out a bit of a roadmap for the next few episodes. As I said, episode 98 is hopefully going to round out the war with the Romans, which Antiochus III has been fighting in some form since episode 88. Following that, in episode 99, we will then round out the reign of Antiochus III, and what an eventful reign it's been. However, that still leaves us with one job, and a very special episode in which to complete it. According to this schedule, episode 100 will be the recap and epithet episode for Antiochus III, who has been with us since 223 BCE, and will be with us until 187. I've been wrestling with which epithet to award Antiochus, and although I believe I've settled on it, I cannot be fully sure until the episode arrives. Incidentally, if you have any suggestions for an epithet for our current king, or indeed any from the past, feel free to drop me a line at the show's email address, and they will be mentioned in the episode. That brings us to the final subject of today. However many weeks ago it was now, I promised you a Q&A episode when we reached episode 100. Well, we'll soon be there. I've already received some questions and topics to cover, which is fantastic, but I'm always happy to discuss more. So, if you have a question for the show, feel free to contact me at afteralexpod@gmail.com, and I will do my best to address it. Alternatively, you can reach me in the comments wherever you find this episode. All that said, that finally brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you all so much for listening. And until next time, have a great week, everyone.